Welcome to the English with Kirsty podcast from www.englishwithkirsty.com. Here I'll be sharing with you tips, information and other learning resources so that you can improve your business English. Hi everybody and welcome back to the English with Kirsty podcast, and today we have another guest interview, so I'm excited to be joined by our guest for today. Julia is somebody that I met at a networking event, so for once it's not somebody that I met on LinkedIn. It's actually I went to a networking event and Julia was the speaker there, so maybe you could start by introducing yourself and tell us something about what you do.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm Julia, and I work as a brand voice consultant. So I work with businesses specifically around the voice of their brand. So nothing to do with the visual branding, which is what we often think about with the brand, logos and colors. I work mostly with words. So what you're writing in your content and what is the voice behind your brand. So working with companies to really help them develop it, to document it, to actually measure what their voice is, and then to be able to delegate it and scale up.
Yeah, and I like this because for me as well, I'm all about words, all about language, people speaking, using English as an additional language and developing their own voice and then their brand's voice in English.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think why do you think this gets forgotten about? Why do you think people focus so much on the visual branding?
It's a great question. And I think some of it is because I think it's seen as more acceptable to not be your own expert at the visual branding. Like that's considered kind of a separate thing, that if you wouldn't call yourself, artistic, if you wouldn't think that you're really good with colors or with design, it's really acceptable for you to outsource that and to have someone help you design a logo and for you to tell them, kind of what you want the brand to be about, and then have them develop something visual. But I think there's a lot of expectation for business owners and for entrepreneurs to be able to articulate what they do in the way that they want to articulate it. That if you can't, sound the way you want to sound, then that's kind of on you. That's not considered a separate skill set. That's just you being bad at what you do. Which is ironic because a lot of people in their businesses, they have nothing to do with writing or with speaking or with articulating what they do. They might have a product that they produce. They might be a clothing brand, or they might be a, beverage brand. And that really doesn't have anything to do with being articulate. But for some reason, it gets wrapped up in this, if you can't say what you mean, then that's something that you should just innately be able to do, and it's not, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think we don't think about it a lot as well. Like you see so much information for business owners about the visual branding, and in the podcast episode before this one, we were talking about our voice in our first language and then our voice in an additional language, if we have one, and how they can be different and how we can bring them closer together so that the voice in the additional language better reflects who we really are. Yes. But I think if you haven't thought about who you really are and how you want to come across, and what qualities you have, then it's difficult to understand whether you're doing that in another language as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my experience, and this is kind of how I got into brand voice, was I started my business as a copywriter, and was working to develop what my process was to work with clients of trying to get the information I needed to be able to write in a way that they wanted, and getting people to, again, articulate, what it is that they want to sound like. I think a lot with writing, a lot with brand voice, it's left up to intuition. It's left up to just kind of how it comes out off the top of your head. And what's been really interesting for me with getting more specialized in brand voice is actually seeing that it's measurable, that these aren't things that you just have to guess at or go, oh, this happened to come out really nicely, but this other piece didn't work. You can actually quantify it, and then you can replicate it. And it's like writing down a recipe, like if you make something really tasty and you wanted to make that again, or you wanted to have anyone else who can make that same dish, having a written down recipe is what's going to allow you to do that. And that's kind of essentially what I do with Brand Voice, is help people decide what they want to make, but then also actually write it down so that they can recreate it, and anyone else that they bring on, like a copywriter or marketer, can recreate it as well.
It's like a style for your brand. Like, people have style guides in terms of how visually and certain terminology that they want to use or avoid. It's building on that so that other people understand how you want your brand to speak, I guess.
Yes. Yep, exactly.
And you did a whole kind of training session on this presentation. I know it's kind of a big topic, but if I was wondering if we could look at what you were saying before about the components of our voice. Maybe you could summarize some information about that for anyone who's interested to learn a bit more. So what are the components of our voice?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm working with someone to develop and document their voice, I look at 4 things. So I look at their words, tone, cadence, and style. Their words are exactly what it sounds like. Those are your language choices, right? So that's something too where, thinking about translating something into a different language, to me, just opens up so many possibilities, because word choice is so specific and there's different kind of nuance that comes. And I can imagine that's tricky when you're translating it into a different language, or writing in maybe your second language. The direct translation word might not always actually be the word that you want, right? So that kind of
really is.
adds some trickiness there. But I'm writing in my native language of English. Most of my clients are as well. And so their language choice is very telling of their voice. It can be telling of even accents, right? Like, I'm Canadian, so I spell my words with a U. I write different words. I say garbage instead of, I live in the States and I'm Canadian. So even my language will set me apart as a Canadian. It'll set people apart regionally. It'll set people apart in terms of their kind of social group. So it's very specific, the language that we choose. And it's often unconscious, but once you kind of recognize that that's a big part of your voice, you can more consciously choose the words that you are using. So that's the first part. Tone is the piece that I think most people kind of classically think of when they think of a voice guide. It's often you get, a list of kind of 3 words that describe your brand, and that's considered your brand voice guide. So the tone is there, and it's a big piece of it. But what I think often gets missed is that it's just one of the components. It's not the full story. And if you were to hand someone a brand voice guide that says, my brand voice is friendly and professional, not only does that not go into enough detail to be of use, but it's also open to so much interpretation. And that's what's so interesting, is when I do my brand voice identity calls with people, we start with the tone. We go through a really, I think it's a very fun process of determining what tones they want to have represent their brand. And what's interesting to me is every time I do this, I have people have such strong reactions to different words, and I have them interpret them differently. And it's so interesting to me that these are the same words that I go through every person with on these calls, and yet they interpret them differently. And so it's that nuance of, like, what does being critical mean to you? Is it that you're criticizing someone, or is it that you're using critical thinking? So if you were to list the word critical as one of your brand voice tones without giving people more of the full context around this, you're going to have copywriters and marketers that are heading off in completely the wrong direction.
Yeah, I would see that as quite positive, like, critical of misinformation, but sure. I guess some people would see that as, all you can do is criticize everyone else and you've got nothing good to say. Yeah, that's
exactly. And it's those, that's quite an extreme example, but there's a lot of nuance in the way that we interpret tone words. And so really working with people to get deeper than just a list of words and going, what flavor of each of these tones are you going for, and how do they fit together, and how does your experience your outlook, your values, how does all of that influence the tone of your brand? So words, tone, cadence is the third one. And when I say cadence, I'm really talking about kind of the rhythm of your voice. So if you think about writing, we can look at sentence length, we can look at paragraph length, we can look at even the spacing. Some people put like a space between each kind of line. Some people put 2 spaces between each line. Some people just push it all together and it's one giant paragraph. But it's the flow of your writing. And what's really interesting to me about the cadence is that it's so measurable and it's so practically adjustable. So we typically start with the tones. The language, like I said, is largely informed by other kind of elements of where they're coming from. But cadence and style, so cadence, like the rhythm of your voice, if something feels off, if you're writing something and you're thinking like, this is not how I want it to sound, the cadence is what I usually start with adjusting, because it's not something that you have to guess at. Like tone can be, it's hard to necessarily find the nuance between being cheeky and being cheerful. But what you can do is very practically change the length of your sentences, right? If you've written something and the average length of your sentences is 23 words, cut it in half, take it down to 12 words per sentence, and you'll automatically change the tone. You'll automatically have to change the language that you're using to accommodate that. So it's something where we unconsciously notice the cadence of writing and of language, or of voices, I should say, but we don't often pay attention to it.
And I guess there are tools that can do that, right? So if you want to
yes.
check how long your sentences are, generally you can do that.
Yes. Yeah. The one that I use is called Verbatim. It was developed by Justin Blackman, who's the brand voice specialist that I learned from. And it is a really good tool in terms of giving you some of these metrics behind your voice. So it can tell you the average sentence length. So cadence is, kind of the rhythm, the flow, your sentence length. And style is the last piece that some people separate. Like you mentioned, there are style guides. APA is a classic style guide that's all about punctuation. But I include it in my voice guides because it's such a personal thing that comes up with voice. And a lot of people don't necessarily realize their preferences around it until you ask them about it, or you have them tell you, what would you put here, right? Would it be a period? Would it be a dash? Would it be an ellipses? Do you add brackets? What do you add brackets for? Like, do you do them as little asides? Do you do them as additional information? How do you use all of these different elements that we have available to us to stylize your voice? And some people use very, classic punctuation, which would be usually following like an APA style guide. And other people, especially as we're writing more and more on social media, the style that people are using is changing. And it's a way for you to have your audience hear your voice the way that you want it to. You can use bolding or italics to emphasize different words. You can have, what would have been a run-on sentence and you add a dash. You can have an ellipses to end a list of bullet points. There's so many options. And usually when we start getting into this, it becomes really apparent that people who go, well, I don't really, have any strong opinions about punctuation, do have very strong opinions about punctuation.
Because they never thought about it. Now they're thinking about it, they realize,
yeah.
And I think sometimes it's because we're told, like, you should not do this. This is the right way. And some things are okay, some things are wrong, but some things are a style choice. And we make those choices all the time if we're writing more informally, like to our friends, or so we do have ideas. But I think sometimes, especially looking at language, some things are wrong. You can't do it because it's incorrect. But a lot of things are about you. And it's important to know what they are and how you feel, especially if you're giving that work to someone else as well. But also because a lot of the people that I'm working with are freelancers, are small business owners, they probably don't have a team. But for you to show up every day, or not every day, but every time you write something, or every time you show up online, people get to expect certain things from you. And if that changes suddenly because somebody else said you should write in a different way, or told you to do it, then some people notice. Not everyone, because not everyone's paying attention, but people who notice do notice, and it doesn't fit with the rest of what you're doing. So it's, I mean, the next question was going to be, why is it important? I guess I've answered it partly, but I'm sure you have more to say. Why is it important for freelancers and small business owners to be aware of all these things, and to care about them, to incorporate them into their writing strategy?
Yeah, it is a really fair question. And it's something that, there's so much right now. I think we're very much in the era of, personal branding and leaning into the idea of, how to set yourself apart. And it's worthwhile advice in many ways. What I think people run into is, especially with voice, it's really hard when you don't know what you're looking at to understand what's going on, how to create a voice that is both uniquely yours and functional, and how to consistently recreate that. Because what's interesting is, especially talking with solopreneurs, and I've had this experience in my own business, is that when you work with one mentor, you kind of end up sounding like them. And then you work with another mentor and you kind of end up sounding like them. And, obviously we all kind of gather these influences as we go through life, and we read different books and we work with different people. But it can be really challenging sometimes. There are so many rules out there, or best practices, and everyone seems to have a different take on it. Even scrolling through my Facebook feed, I see, advice of make sure that your content is at a grade 5 level or below. Make sure that you're leading with your expertise in all of your content, or make sure that you're leading with your accessibility in all of your content, or, make sure that you're never using industry kind of lingo terms in your content, or go for it with there's so much contradictory advice. And what I find is that the people that I see, talking about messaging, talking about brand voice, and they have these really strong, like, you must always do this kind of rules, it immediately gets my hackles up a little bit, because I am terrible at following rules. And what it's come down to is that learning about brand voice, the framework that I use and that I learned from Justin, basically looks at 9 different types of voices. And obviously there are variations within those 9 types, and there are hybrid voices and all that, but generally there are 9 kind of categories. And what's really interesting is that almost all of those blanket statement advice pieces, like write at a grade 5 level or below, that is advice for a specific voice type. But the thing is that
audience as well.
There are 9 other or 8 other types, right? So it's something where we get all these coaches and mentors that are, I think, genuinely, doing their best to give people the advice that they think is good, but it narrows the options so far, and you end up with people who would naturally speak or write at a grade, 11, 12 level. They're trying to cram their voice into a grade 3 level, and it's not working.
And the people that they are trying to communicate with are not expecting that. They would maybe see that as, well, this is not an expert, because if they were, then they would write in a different way.
Exactly.
And I guess this is also why I know some people are moving more towards getting AI generated text, but you can tell that is not them a lot of the time. You can really,
yes,
it may be all the same, but it's not. It may be consistently misrepresentative, but it's not. You can't. I can understand why some people sometimes do that to avoid mistakes, if they're worried about mistakes in English, for example, or in writing in another language.
Yes.
But it's a really good way to introduce mistakes, for one thing. But on the other hand, it's not you. And I think, like, the point you were making about the advice is that the advice is suggesting that there's a right way to do it for everybody, and that doesn't work with marketing, with communication, with anything, with learning for that matter. Not everybody learns in the same way. So finding out what does work for you, and what kind of voice you want to use to communicate with people.
Yes.
And I guess you could have more than one of the 9 voices. I guess you could choose 2, depending on your audience or depending on the type of content. It doesn't have to be like, this is my voice, 1 out of 9, I'm only going to do that. I guess
absolutely. No, it's not meant to box you in. It's meant to really open up the options. And what's really interesting is that most of the people that I work with, myself included, end up with a hybrid voice. And there was a coach that I was just working with last week. I wrapped up her brand voice guide. And what we found was that in her content, she uses 2 different, so the voice types that she had were one that's called parent voice, which is it's more nurturing. It's more kind of the, I've been there and I've figured out a way for you to avoid the same pitfalls that I that I did, right? It's kind of that it is an authoritative voice, but it's with that nurturing undertone. And it typically has kind of a lower grade level. It's more accessible on the language choices, the sentence length, kind of the cadence is a more medium length. And her other voice that she was bringing in was one that we call yogi. And it's very kind of meditative. It's very transformation based. It's very experiential. It's talking about what it feels like to have gone through the transformation that she offers. And yogi voices are typically very, very long sentences, quite elevated language, and they almost just kind of wrap you up. You don't necessarily understand all of the language that they're using. They can use a lot of lingo, a lot of kind of, is it astrology or astronomy? I always get those confused, but a lot of the like star signs, those kinds of people, astrology, use a lot of that language where you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, but it sounds like incredible. So she has this really interesting mix of yogi and parent. And what we found was that actually clicked for her when she was thinking about her approach to, she's a storytelling coach, and her approach to helping women discover, and well, not discover, but tell their stories, is that combination where she talks about the transformation of it and kind of the impact that this has, but she also has practical strategies and has that kind of like, ooh, I've been there before and I tried this and it didn't work, so let me show you a way that does work. So her blend of those 2 was so interesting to see. And what was happening a lot with her content and with the marketing company that she was using was that they didn't understand those 2 voices, and they didn't understand which content, which ideas were better conveyed in a parent voice or which ideas were better conveyed in a yogi voice. So they had these rambly sentences about her like step-by-step strategies, which doesn't make any sense. Like that's the wrong context to use a yogi voice. So it's those kinds of things where you can have nearly all of the pieces together, but if you don't have the understanding of which contexts are supported by which voices, you end up with this kind of mishmash of things that are almost right, but not.
Something's missing. Something isn't quite clicking.
Yes. And that's what I see a lot of people struggle with, when they're using AI, is they'll input all of this stuff and AI will generate something that is technically right. It's technically what they asked for, but it doesn't sound like them. And that's where understanding those 4 pieces of your words, tone, cadence, and style can really help. Because if you get something back from AI and you go, this is close, but not right, start working your way through those 4 things, right? Is it that the language is off, right? Are they being like Coolio dudes where you would never say that? Is it the tone? Are they more, condescending versus you were going for more, jovial? Is it the cadence? Did they write in weird sentence length? Or is it just the style, right? If you added a dash instead of a ellipses, would that fix it? So you have kind of this toolkit that you can go through instead of just throwing your hands up and going, it doesn't sound right.
Yeah, and I think I remember that you have something on your website with examples of the different voices. Is that right? Where can
Yeah.
people find out about them?
Yes, great reminder. So on my website, juliamichelleagency.com, it should be just at the bottom. It's a long one-page website. If you scroll to the bottom, there's an opt-in that you can get a copy of a PDF where I wrote what is essentially the same email in the 9 different voices. And what's really cool about it is that you can not only see an example of the 9 different voices, which gives you some kind of context around all of the different options that you have available to you in your brand, but I've also included what I call a little cheat sheet at the bottom of each voice that gives you the metrics of their words, tone, cadence, and style. So you can actually see for each voice type, what are they doing with those 4 elements? And if you like one, if you think, yeah, maybe this translator voice is the one that is the closest to what I'm aiming for, you can actually use those metrics that I've included in the cheat sheet to essentially reverse engineer your own voice to be closer to that. So it's a really fun resource to look through. And I've also included at the bottom, there are a couple just kind of exercise prompts. If you wanted to try adjusting things in your voice, there are some ideas and some examples of how you can do that.
Okay, and because we've got a lot of actual translators who listen to the podcast, translator, you mean like getting one idea and re-explaining it in another way, or what is the translator?
Good question. No, I should clarify. Translator is one of the 9 voice types, and it's one that's very simple. It does follow a lot of what would be classic copywriting rules, where you're making complex ideas simple. And so it is a voice type that I see a lot of advice around. But again, it's just one of the 9. So you don't have to simplify everything for your audience. But that is definitely a type that's available.
Yeah, and I think with this document, for me, it made more sense to see the examples as well, because then you can, okay, but also to say, oh, I cannot read. Oh, well, I can read, but I do not want to read as a customer copy like this. So this is probably not what I'm going to. So you can also look at your reactions to the texts to see how you react to them. So, oh, I like this. This feels good. This is comfy pair of shoes. All this. Oh God, I would never ever speak to my audience. And if you get those reactions as well, that gives you an idea of which ones are probably going to be more suited to the way you want to communicate.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what's so interesting to me is that, like you said, reading through it, almost everyone has these intuitive hits, right? Of like, oh, I really like that. Or like, oh, Lord, that is absolutely not what I would go for. And usually that's where kind of messaging or voice things stop, is you go like, oh, I like this. And then you try and replicate it. But what's great, and the reason I include that cheat sheet is so that you can actually see the metrics that back up your intuition. That you can go, oh, the reason this one sounds different is because the sentence length is twice as long, or because the grade level of their language is, a grade 8 instead of a grade 3. So it's really neat to be able to see the metrics that give you the why behind your intuition that this is a different voice.
Yeah, and then it's easier to, if you can't quite get what you're looking for, you can look and see what you can modify to bring it more in line.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is something that anyone can access. Anyone can sign up for your mailing list and access this information. But in terms of working more closely, like on a one-to-one consultancy basis, what kind of business owners, or what kind of do you work with a certain industry, or do you have any like ideal customers? How would you describe the people you can help?
Yeah. So what's been really interesting is when I was working as a copywriter and a mentor for other copywriters, my audience was quite narrow. I was working specifically with copywriters. And since narrowing to my services to work with brand voice, it's actually widened my audience quite a bit. So I don't have a specific, industry that I work with, but the type of people that I find this work most helpful for are businesses who have a proven concept, right? They know that they're good at what they do. Their marketing is working. They're getting clients, they're getting those results. They have that proven concept, but they might be at a pivotal point in their business where they're either looking to scale up or they're looking to find a more specific direction. They might have been doing this for a while and are going, oh, I kind of want to do my own thing. So it's that kind of pivot piece where what they're doing is working, but they're wanting it to work better or work differently. And this work of getting clear on your brand voice, to me, is the piece that I see so many businesses missing as they kind of go after one thing or the next, and they just kind of ping pong around. So doing this work first will really let you have a clear direction, have something that is actionable for, as we talked about, either yourself as a solopreneur, writing your own content and getting better at being consistently the way that you want to sound, showing up the same way every time. Or if this has been something that's on your list of things that you want to delegate, having a voice that is clear and documented is what lets you hand someone basically a user manual of how to write like you. So it's those kind of pivotal pieces of wanting to grow, wanting to change, wanting to tweak something to kind of take it to a new level or a new direction that I find brand voice really, really helpful for.
Okay, so I'll include your link to your website on our show notes page. Is there a social media platform that you enjoy more than the others? Where do you hang out?
Yeah, I'm mostly on Facebook.
Okay.
But I would say the best way to get in touch with me is just to send me an email if people are interested. I'm happy to answer questions. Of course, they can book a call with me as well. Everything's on my website. But email, Facebook, those are both good.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you for giving us something to think about, something that is often either ignored or forgotten about or just not even thought about. So I think it's good to have this conversation, and whether you as a listener are working in your first language or an additional language, these things still apply. They may be a bit more complicated, there may be more to think about, but they still apply and they're still relevant. So have a think about it, have a think what best represents you, and maybe have a look at these 9 voice types and see which ones you identify with most. Okay, thanks for coming on the podcast and have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the English with Kirsty podcast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is kirsty@englishwithkirsty.com, or you can go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast, where you'll find information about the individual episodes.